Thank you all for coming here. I'm really excited being here in the world in one piece, you know. And yeah, so I've spent the last 13 years working, maybe 12, I don't know, working with single-page applications. And you know, I plan to tell you like all the truth about them, which is like they suck, right? Just stop doing that stuff. Anyway, yeah. I mean, there is a site which it's one of the biggest Ukrainian e-commerce sites, and one brilliant mind decided to do it like an SPA. It's like I'm not cheating on anyone. That was me. And why do we do that like an SPA? There are a lot of reasons why SPA as like single-page application is really compelling. Like its composability is much better than what we had before with jQuery, and then it seemed like long-term maintenance is much easier with single-page applications because I mean it's all composed as well, and you can understand what's going on. And when you have like 300 selectors somewhere in one jQuery file, right, and it's just a mess, and that is like much better. And then when you have those components, like what React promised, you have a split is going to be in some logical places rather than by technology where you have JavaScript separately from HTML and stuff like that. And then you have this promise that your UI is a function of a state, which is like amazing and really nice. And you have unified API. What I mean by that is that your API for web application and for native applications for Android and iPhones is the same. And when your developers make API for web application, you can make them a native application, which was important for us because before that we did separate API, which was an afterthought. So a mobile application couldn't do everything that our web application did. And like faster development because you can split work and do API in one team and then front-end in another team. Which is a lie, of course, because when you split work by teams, it takes more time rather than less time. And then in 6 years, we've got a 2.5 megabytes minified file, and old Androids don't really lower the side. And then like performance, Google PageSpeed told us everything about performance, right? It just says there is no performance, and we didn't do anything like really weird or dumb. It's just with time it becomes bigger and bigger, and it just is slowed down by itself, and it's not a technology for performance anyway. So yeah, performance is bad. Its complexity is through the roof because you hire a whole team of front-end developers, which when they're developers, right? So what developers do, they write code and add complexity. So there is a lot of complexity there. And then at some point, it's React, so it's easy to do stuff on hover, right, in the logic of an application and not somewhere in CSS. So it's slow, and your mouse goes, and you can see like it's sometimes it's a little bit slow of showing something, and then it doesn't work like you wanted it to. And then business logic, which is the worst part of everything, I think. Business logic is starting to migrate on the client side because your backend developers do the simplest API they can do, which is like just an transformation from database to the API, and that's it. And then front-end developers start doing business logic and features right in the client. And then there are 3 clients, which is web application, Android application, and iOS application. And the business logic is in every of them, and it's a little bit different. And so some of them is wrong about displaying data, and you have to mandate that business logic should go. Okay, it's a mess. And then code base, it's like, it's split, right? There is backend, there is front end. It's hard to make a quick hack to see why if something will work, because you have to write it on backend and deploy that stuff and write it on front end. And then one thing which really irritated me is that backend people became really backend people. They're like, well, I don't really know front-end. I can do anything. I wrote an API. It's okay, right? And I'm like, yeah. And then the front-end guy comes and says that API is really impossible to use, right? Because nobody even tried to use it. It's just some imagination, and they're like really helpless children there. Anyway, so I mean, I'm not going back to jQuery anyway. There is no way I'm going to back to jQuery, because that mess is like, it's not it doesn't take 6 years to be bad. It just takes like a few months usually, or maybe if you're very, very like good at managing selectors, and it's 2 years anyway. And your logic is gonna be like a peanut butter on a bread, right? You just can't then like bring it together back. And then composability, like that is not a word in jQuery world at all, because like that component looks for that selector, that component, not component, that piece of code looks for that selector, that piece of code looks for another, and they are somehow similar. And then there is a new thingy growing up which has same element with same class because it's happened so, and then it starts all conflicting and blowing up. And on your checkout, if you're on a table, you can't buy anything because, I mean, it thinks you're on a phone, but not. It's a different sized screen. So anyway, jQuery, whatever. Let's like. So what I did, actually, what happened? I opened my old MacBook Air back in before COVID. What was it? 2020, right? 3 years ago, anyway. I opened my old MacBook Air, and our site is really slow. It's slow to the point where it's slow on MacBook Air, which is like, I don't think most of our clients had even that. So I was thinking, how can we do anything which is not jQuery and not single-page applications? What do we do? And I really want composability. That is like my goal, to have a long-term thingy, which is not going to need a write in 2 or 6 years. I want it to be like a long-term thing, right? And understandability. I'm sorry, I'm not speaking English lately for last 11 years. So it's a bit of a challenge right now. Anyway, so understandability is another big thingy, because I want a new person to come in and be able to understand what's going on, because that is not happening with jQuery usually. Like when you have a jQuery, a new person comes in and wants to rewrite everything because selector is done in a wrong way, right? You have to do it like their way and not the other way. And with React, it's a matter of training, but there are questions. And then what I really wanted is server-side HTML rendering, because what browsers do well, they render HTML. That is like the thing they are trained to do by the big companies. And JavaScript is what slows them down. So that is like my goal, like destroy JavaScript, employ HTML, and I don't know, make backend developers again, not backend developers. And then it comes to quite a simple concept. Let's say concept. If you could, like, say, go to that URL, grab whatever the output that URL gives, and replace me with that output, it just like, yeah, it went to that URL and grabbed a new link and says updated 1 and updated 2. It just returns incremental thingy. Or you could do that on any element. Like on div, you just click. It's the same backend, so it returns a link. So it's, there is a div replaced by a link, but obviously you could do anything. Or on any event, so that div reacts on hover, because its trigger is mouse enter. And you hover, and it's still updated to the link, so it doesn't react on hover because, well, because that the same link. would say, like, could we call that organized fragment replacement? I don't know how to call that, but the thing is, it's like usual HTML, but instead of changing the whole page, you just change the part you need. It's first, let's talk about tech stuff, right? Because when you first, anyway, let's talk about tech first. It's really simple to do that, right? You could do that with jQuery in like 10 lines maybe. Anyway, if you want to get involved, it was 200. I looked up what was first version. It was 200 lines of code, and I wrote in a single union. And it's really lightweight because it's 200 lines of code, and it's really fast because there is nothing to do, right? Just go to the server, and it's quite composable, which is when you look at that first time, it doesn't really sound like that, but it weirdly is, because it's right here in your template, it's written, replace that stuff with the stuff from that URL. That is very understandable and pretty composable, because you don't need to go to the other URL, to the other file to understand what is going on here, usually. And a nice part is that it's limited. I used like in Python versus C++ limited, but I think it's more like JSON versus Python limited, right? Because you don't get Turing complete whatever. It's very narrow what it can do, which limits the amount of damage a developer can do to your project, right? And developers all about doing damage, right? And then it turns out that when you build a lot of stuff in that library, like you put everything you need, and it's still 8 kilobytes. It's still really small. It's pretty extensible, and it's still easy to understand what's going on. And if there is a bug, it's usually like an hour of debugging to understand what is going on here. And yeah, why it's not 99%, right? Why it's still 78? So we rewrote the whole site. It's a big site. It was 30-something thousand lines of React code. So it's not a small, there is a lot of functionality. We actually spent like 4 months on rewriting the first page, because there is a lot of functionality you have to get to make it like work like before. And in the end, we've got 78%, 78 score, whatever, they're unicorns, right? Because we're using Google Analytics, TikTok Pixel, whatever, Facebook stuff, and the Google reduces your score for using their analytics. But the thing is, first, our JavaScript is 2 orders of magnitude is smaller. Our HTML page is much smaller because it's a weird stuff, right? You would think it's bigger, but the thing is, when you render a single page application on the server and then pass it to the client, and then client needs to hydrate that application, and to hydrate it needs data. And where do you put the data? Well, like in your HTML, right? And the data is like almost 2 times the HTML you returned. So when you remove that data, HTML is suddenly almost 3 times smaller. And then the question everybody asks is like, how much more traffic your application generates after transitioning to that model, to that concept? And it's actually smaller. Because when you render HTML, you just render what needs to be shown. And when you return something in API, it returns like much more data than it needs to be shown, right? Because there is data for mobiles, there is data which another application needs, and we just added it here because it's easier, and there is all kinds of data. And like our application paginated by 60 products, but then our front end paginated by 24 products. So you've got more products than you've shown and stuff like that. And then it turns out that that stuff, even though you're thinking that it's going to be going to backend more often than in a single page application, it's still much faster. because the browser, what the browser doing, it's much less amount, the amount of work is much less than it was before. And the requests are smaller. And if you're opening a product page, you still need to get more data from the backend. And yeah, it turns out it's not a problem. That's a lot of assumption around single page applications turned out to be wrong. And why it's good for backenders actually? Why it's front-end for backenders, right? Because there is, when you write React, there is this weird state management which you have to learn. It's completely different. It's not a request response model. It's whatever. It's weird, and you just throw it out, right? Because you're going to the backend, you're just requesting the URL, and then it's normal request response, and it's so easy. And then you can add interactivity without having any like line of JavaScript. And I'll show you how that works for more complex cases than the simple button, right? It's time, turns out. Yeah, I did a few examples, and I don't know where to start. Like, let's do animated pagination. I don't think I'll be able to explain what's going on here, but the fun part is if we view source, and that is our source, there is no JavaScript at all. There is CSS for transitions, so that when it comes out, when it comes in, right? But then I don't think I need to explain it right now because it's going to be awkward. But the thing is, just look at how it works. Yeah? I mean, isn't it beautiful? There is no JavaScript. There is no weird magic. And it's amazing. I mean, it's much better than what we had before with single-page application, because when front-enders tend to write, when front-enders are writing JavaScript, they don't really want to work on animations because it's really weird in single-page applications. It's complex APIs, and it's so hard, so they're like, whatever, can we not do any transitions here? And now it's like, I mean, yeah, you have to learn that syntax for transitions, but I mean, it's not that hard, right? Anyway, that is not impressive. Like, for me, it's nice, but it's not mind-blowing. What is, like, let's look at autocomplete. That one is a bit involved. If you look at what it's doing here, a lot of crap, right? Unfortunately, if you look at HTML, how do you look here? If you look at HTML, it's written in a way where it's easier to read. I mean, I can try to explain actually if you're interested. I don't know. Should we spend time? What is about our time? I have plenty. Yeah. So what is it doing? There is an input called Q. And it's making a request to autocomplete, and it's saying, like, please use, there are three strategies, like prevent new requests from happening, like use whatever came, and use the last one came. And we want last one. And before making a request, there is a little dumb syntax, little dumb language which you can hook in, that is one of parts of that library, and trigger on key up if something changed with a delay of 100 milliseconds. So it's pretty involved, right? It's a complex autocomplete input, which is good because autocomplete is hard. And then please don't write in myself rendering that target, and don't replace the target, but just put it in target, and then it wants at least 2 non-space characters to be triggered, to be valid, and yeah, placeholder. And if we look how it works, like, I don't know, so it's invalid, right? And then now it's valid. I mean, that's the autocomplete we're using. Okay, I don't have internet. That's the yeah, I just copied from our code because I mean that is too hard for an example, I think. And if every other request is slow, it's like you're writing, right? It's coming in weird Okay, so I have to redo it because it's using last response and not last request, which is dumb. And yeah, sorry. Okay, I think that's a bug. And that one is, I think that one is, it's weird, but forms are really complex, and that is the hardest example ever. And yeah, so what we want to do, we want to make an inline validation while user is typing. And yeah, so it says, please enter odd numbers. You have to like do something. So it's 14, but with only with odd numbers. And if you enter 6, and the fun part is that you're typing, it's not odd, right? It's when it's odd, it doesn't really react. And you're typing, it changes, and it doesn't break your focus. And that is pretty hard problem, even for, there are problems with React, right? When React doesn't react in 16 milliseconds, the input is gonna be broken. And here, it's not gonna be broken because the algorithm updating HTML is pretty fancy here. Anyway, so if we write 5 here and 9 here, and it's gonna be valid, right? And we can submit that stuff and I'm sorry. Oh, I mean, I'm done. Everything's okay, right? It would be like if you, yeah, it was okay. I need to write some green label. I need to put some green label there because I was like, whatever, I wasn't working. So, yeah, I don't know. There is a, how do I find it? There is an interesting thingy. Right, okay. Sorry, I forgot there is an interesting test hidden where Rick Ashley dances and then you press a button and he doesn't stop dancing, which is also, it's the same algorithm as with dynamic forms, so that the active element is not messed up, right? That is the important part. Anyway, so here is a little documentation about that is the whole API. It's, yeah, it's okay. I have to talk about downsides as well, right? It's not the same technology as what Stacks was showing us, so it has some downsides. And the first, sorry, the first downside is that front-end developers, well, one of them just left the company because, I mean, he wants to do React because that is like his money is flowing in. Front-end developers don't really like that stuff, it seems. Keeping the same API, if that is a problem for you, right? If you have native applications, you have to think about having API for them, because before that you were required to do that, and now you like, I don't know. What we did to solve that, we are still using API inside of our backend application, but just like not going through HTTP, calling those methods directly. In that way, the developer still writes an API method and then calls it instead of just going through directly to database or something like that. The next problem is that figuring out patterns, how do you do stuff, is it really takes time. So when we start, we became much better. We became much better at that particular task in a year or so, maybe half a year, because it seems like single-page applications got in our minds so like hard that you're thinking in that terms, and that it turns out if you do just normal HTML page, which works without reloads, with JavaScript, with reloads, without JavaScript, like just regular 90s style HTML page, then from that part, updating into interactivity is much easier than just thinking about interactivity right away, because you're thinking about React and how it takes time to like relearn. And then when you have a product page, which is a pretty complex page, and then there is some sidebar with the complex interactions, and there is a lot of stuff going on, and it asks you for some promotions, and it all connects. And if you buy something, it shows you this, please pay with your card thingy, and then it hides, and you need to update a product page. And that stuff is harder than in React because your logic is like it's being distributed by parts of your application, and it's a pain. And just so for downsides, I went to the guy at Casta who is still working there and asked him what are the downsides, and he's like, "Oh man, I fucking hate that." And I'm like, "So would you like go to React?" No, well, never. So it's like a trade-off, right? Because the complex stuff is much harder, but there is one complex stuff in the whole project, and everything else is much easier now. And stuff like checkout, which is feels like checkout is really hard, right? Because there is a lot of interaction, stuff changes, and you select a lot of forms. But it turns out that stuff like that is actually really good with a library like that, because you have a single function like controller for a whole wizard, and you're just iterating on that state bit by bit. So it turns out stuff like that, wizards are not. It's easy. But anyway, it's really easy to approach. It's fun to work with. It feels so much more fun because it's more lightweight and it's faster to start. And it's fast, not in like development time fast. It's then fast in performance, which is amazing. So you've got like 3 parts, which is it's easy to start, it's maintainable, and its performance is good. And in the end, somehow it's less work than it was before with a single-page application for us. Sure, I'm almost at the end. So there is the same idea. HTMx is much more well-known library with a with a community at all, because my library doesn't really have a community, because I didn't really spend time promoting or something. And why we are not using HTMx? Because it got written in a month later than I did, so we just kept using, and it doesn't have a few features which we used heavily. And HTMx is written by the same guy who invented the concept, so it's maybe you should go there, look at it, but yeah, whatever. And then Unpoly is another contender. It's the same idea, but it's so much bigger. It's like it's 10 times bigger, and there are a lot of object-oriented stuff in the source code, and I hate it because it's not really needed. So yeah, whatever. And then another approach to the problem I had, which is like, how do I drop single-page application from my project and go forward, is live view, which is something Phoenix invented, right? Phoenix is that Rails-like framework in Elixir, which is another syntax for Erlang, and they have a lot of interesting ideas there. And live view, in essence, is a thingy which is there is a little JavaScript file which catches all the events on the page where you click somewhere or stuff like that, sends it over WebSockets to the server, and then web server returns new HTML for your browser to render, which is in demos, it's mind-blowing. It's really good. It's developer experience is like in React, where you write function of a state and stuff like that. But there are 2 problems why I didn't go that way. First, there is a state held in memory on the server, which means if you have 2,000 clients, you will have to have a lot of servers, because, I mean, it takes some memory to handle that state. It's not like 4 bytes, right? It's like some tens of kilobytes, I think. And that bothered me. And another thing about WebSockets is that their performance. So the problem is that in proof of concept state, that stuff works perfectly. But then under high load, first, there are no reports in the internet about companies using that and having more than 100 clients. So, which is a little bit concerning to me. Second, we've played a lot with WebSockets. And when you have like a big sale and there is 5,000 people on the site online, all the thing you built for 1,000 people breaks, and WebSockets are just putting so much load because there are a lot of concurrent connections. And with the HTMx TwinSpark concept, the nice part is that your backend is like, it's like you can put Varnish, Cloudflare, you can put HTML caching, you can learn what is cache control, right? You can do all the stuff you like do with normal HTML, and it's works nicely. So that's why we went that way. Anyway, that's for real now. Any questions? Thank you for listening. Do I have time for questions?
Yeah.
Okay. Right.
You mentioned that there is a potential problem with different APIs for web applications and phones.
Right.
So I assume you also have to rewrite a bit of the backend to...
No.
You didn't rewrite the backend?
No. So the question is, I mentioned that there is disconnect for different APIs, and did we rewrite an API for that stuff? The disconnect is not because that new front end required different API. The disconnect is because if a developer writes a whole feature, will he think about mobile applications? If he's writing just an API and then, okay, and then, how do you say it? That's not me. If he's writing just an API and thinks about all those three applications, he's thinking about them, right? But if he is writing just a whole feature and whereas front end, will he write an acceptable API? That is the question. And how we mitigated that, we actually didn't. So our backend is in Clojure, our front end was in Clojure script, and when it was rendered on the server, it was executed in the same JVM as Clojure. So what we did, we dropped API React from the front end, but the backend code and the markup code remains the same, and it works the same right now with the same code. So yeah, but I mean, it wouldn't be a problem in Python anyway. So you would just, my idea is that you can write an API and then write a consumer that API, which calls it right in the process, right? Which is, it's gonna be fast, and you will have like that. Like people love splitting view logic with business logic, right? And that's where you can split in your like API. Yeah.
Yeah. So when I was implementing something like 1.5 years ago, I tried HTMx because it seemed like what you.
Yeah, it is.
Tried,
It is. It
like,
is.
Amazing. I want to do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then I found out that for me, like I was having a table with like 500 cells, like 50 by 10, and updating a few of those cells by sending the complete table back and forth was very slow because you don't have a virtual DOM.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't know exactly which cells it needs to update. It updated every cell.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a big problem for me because that was a big part of the UI. And so I stepped away from that and went with Vue, but yeah.
Yeah, so what I think is that that approach is not, shouldn't be like all-encompassing approach for your whole application, right? If there are some places which needs more logic in JavaScript, like, well, here you go, you have to do that. It's just in most applications there is no real need, right? And yeah, I think maybe there could be a way invented where you can like put that stuff in that model, but does it need to be like, sometimes you can just write some JavaScript. If you like look at the sources at Cast.ua, there are like I don't know, 20 or 30 kilobytes of JavaScript anyway for custom stuff and for some pop-ups, stuff like that. Yeah, I think it's okay, right? You can start small, and then where you need, you just put more effort.
Thanks.
Sure.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I'm a front-ender myself.
Sorry, man.
So have you ever heard of Next.js?
Yeah, I hate it with a passion. Yeah, I mean, I hate, like, so much complexity is going on front end right now. That is like, I mean, it's a weird thing, but back in 2016, when we went with a single-page application, we wrote in ClojureScript, so you can imagine where this is going, right? We didn't touch any of the JavaScript tooling stuff and crap, like Webpack, whatever. I don't really need it because everything is done in the ClojureScript. It has its own tooling, and that ClojureScript stuff was extremely stable. And I was looking from the distance at the stuff going on in the JavaScript world. And you certainly can live with that. There is no I mean, of course, a lot of people live with that. And if you learn, it seems okay. But when you look at it from outside, it's weird how much complexity is there, which feels shouldn't be. And there are layers of that stuff, right? Because Next is not fun anymore. You have to use Astro. Do you use Astro?
No.
But you should. I don't know.
Yes, but for just the amount of features and the amount of optimization that is possible within it is way beyond what we have.
Yeah, but that.
Especially now with the React 18 and server components and caching at the fetch level.
So that's what I was talking about. I want my stuff to work in 6 years time, and the JavaScript churn, it's will it work in a year or two? I don't know, because the history says it won't.
You're referring to?
To the constant changes of React and constant changes in Next supporting React and that optimization. Yeah, there is, but I mean, it's a complex discussion. We can leave it after the talk, right? Yeah. But the thing is, I wanted to have a low complexity solution. And I mean, the complexity here, it's a child could write that library.
I mean, for example, you also said with the forms, with React not responding instantly. We already fixed that with React Hook Form.
Right. So you have to use library for it.
Yeah, and library.
But you're kind of supporting my point. You understand? I mean, for me that was a problem. The amount of code, the amount of complexity, that was a problem for me. So I wanted a low complexity, low tech approach, so to speak. If you've seen Rich Hickey's Simple Made Easy talk, it is my life philosophy. And if you didn't, I highly recommend it, because even if you don't embrace it by heart, it will make you look at certain problems from the different angle. It's pretty good talk. I think that's his best. Yeah, I'm come to me and chat if you want more, because I'm forced out. Sorry. Thank you.
Sorry, I had to. All right. Thank you so much, Alexandra. That was good talk.